Why you still feel different from everyone else. The quiet ache. No one talks about. You don't feel like you belong. And the most terrifying part is that you never really have. Not in the friendships that looked perfect from the outside. Not in the relationships where someone swore they understood you. Not even in the moments you were surrounded by people who genuinely cared. There has always been something. A gap, a distance, a frequency just slightly off from everyone else in the room. And no matter how many times you have tried to close that gap, it comes back. Quietly, persistently, like a tide that knows exactly where to return. You have done everything right. You have worked on yourself. You have read, reflected, grown. You have had the conversations, set the boundaries, done the healing. And still, there are moments when you sit in a room full of people and feel more alone than you ever do in silence. Moments when someone is talking to you and you are nodding, responding, laughing at the right times, and somewhere behind your eyes, a part of you is watching the whole thing like a stranger watching a film they don't belong in. That is not anxiety. That is not depression. That is something older and deeper and far more specific than any label the world has tried to place on you. And here is what makes it worse. You cannot explain it to anyone, because the moment you try, it sounds like arrogance, like you think you are too good for the world around you. Or it sounds like self-pity. So you stop trying. You carry it alone. You get very good at performing normalcy while something inside you quietly starves. Most people who feel this way spend years trying to fix the symptom. They change environments, relationships, careers, cities, chasing belonging the way a person dying of thirst chases water. And every time they arrive somewhere new, there is a brief moment of hope. Maybe here, maybe this time. And then the feeling returns. Because the problem was never the place. The problem was never the people. Every road taken outward has only led back to the same internal crossroads. What if the feeling of being different is not a malfunction? What if it is the most important signal your inner world has ever sent you, and you have spent your entire life trying to silence it instead of learning to read it? That is the question this video is going to answer. Not with theory, not with inspiration, but with the kind of truth that lands in the body before it lands in the mind, the kind that makes something in you go quiet, because it finally feels like someone is speaking the language you have always thought only you could hear. Stay with this. What comes next will not just explain why you feel different. It will change the way you see that difference entirely. The mask that never quite fits. There is a version of you that the world knows, and there is a version of you that only exists in the silence after everyone has gone home. The world's version is competent, agreeable, functional. It knows when to speak and when to hold back. It laughs when laughter is expected, softens its edges when the room requires it, and has learned, through years of quiet observation, exactly how much of itself it is allowed to show before people start to feel uncomfortable. This version of you is not fake exactly. It is something more complicated than fake. It is a translation, a carefully edited rendering of something far more complex, compressed into a format the world finds easier to receive. And you have become so good at it that most people have no idea it is happening. That is the part no one talks about. Not the mask itself. People talk about masks. What they do not talk about is the exhaustion, the specific, bone-deep tiredness that comes not from doing too much, but from constantly monitoring yourself. From running a background process every single moment in social situations that is asking, is this too much? Am I being too quiet, too loud, too honest, too strange? Did that land wrong? Are they uncomfortable? Most people move through social interactions the way they breathe, automatically without effort. For you, it has never been automatic. It has always required a level of conscious management that is invisible to everyone around you and utterly consuming to you. And the cruelest part is this. Even when it works, even when the conversation flows and everything looks seamless from the outside, you drive home and feel empty. Not relieved, empty. Because the person who showed up was not fully you. And some part of you knows it even when you wish you could just be grateful it went well. This is what psychologists sometimes call the performance of self. It is not unique to people who feel different. Everyone performs to some degree. But for people like you, the performance runs deeper, started earlier, and costs far more. Because it was not a choice you made consciously. It was a strategy you developed as a child, in the moments you learned that your natural way of being, your unfiltered reactions, your intensity, your depth, your sensitivity, was somehow too much for the people around you. So you learned to edit, to compress, to translate, and somewhere along the way you forgot that what you were translating was the original. And originals are always richer than their translations. The mask is not the enemy. It was never the enemy. The problem is not that you built it. The problem is that you have been wearing it for so long that you have started to confuse it for your face. You have started to believe that the edited version is the real one, and that the unedited version is the problem. It is not the problem. It is the point. But before you can understand what that means, you need to understand something deeper. Something that goes beyond behavior, beyond habit, beyond the social strategies you have built over a lifetime. You need to understand what is actually happening inside you, why you perceive things others seem to miss entirely, why you feel everything at a volume that has no mute button. Because this was never just about how you act in a room. This is about how you are wired. And that changes the entire conversation. Why your brain won't let you belong. What if the way you experience the world is not a sensitivity problem, but a perception advantage that no one ever taught you how to carry? Because here is what the science actually shows. Some people's nervous systems are calibrated to process sensory and emotional information at a significantly deeper level than average. Not better, not worse, deeper. They notice the micro-expression that flickers across someone's face before the smile settles. They feel the shift in energy when someone walks into a room pretending to be fine. They absorb the emotional texture of a conversation the way others absorb only its content. Psychologist Elaine Aron, who spent decades researching this trait, found that roughly 15 to 20% of the population carries this wiring. That means if you are in a room of 10 people, 8 of them are operating on a fundamentally different frequency. 8 of them are not picking up what you are picking up. 8 of them are not feeling what you are feeling. And none of them understand why you seem so affected by things that barely register for them. This is not metaphor. This is neurology. Your brain is not broken. It is not overreacting. It is doing exactly what it was built to do, processing at depth at a resolution most people simply do not have access to. The problem was never your perception. The problem was that no one ever handed you the manual for it. No one ever sat you down and said, you experience reality at a higher resolution than most people around you, and that is going to feel profoundly isolating until you understand what it actually means. Instead, the world handed you a different message. Too sensitive, too emotional, too much. Why can't you just relax? And so you took the most extraordinary thing about you, this capacity to feel and perceive and process at depth, and you learned to treat it as a liability. You learned to suppress it, apologize for it, manage it down to a level the room could tolerate. But here is what that suppression costs you. When you silence the part of you that perceives deeply, you do not just stop feeling too much. You stop feeling accurately. You lose contact with the very internal compass designed to guide you toward the right people, the right environments, the right life. You become numb in the exact place you were meant to be most alive. And the feeling of not belonging intensifies, not because you are more broken than before, but because you are now disconnected from the one part of you that could have told you exactly where you do belong. You cannot find your place in the world by turning down your frequency. You can only find it by learning, and finally fully, how to use it. But there is something that makes this even harder, because it is not just about wiring. There is a wound underneath all of this that runs deeper than any brain scan can show. And that wound is where the real answer lives, the wound beneath the difference. No child is born feeling like they do not belong. That feeling is learned. It is learned in the specific moments when a child's inner world, their excitement, their intensity, their sensitivity, their way of seeing, is met not with curiosity, but with correction. The parent who says, "Stop being so dramatic," to a child who is genuinely overwhelmed. The teacher who tells the student who thinks too deeply to just give the simple answer. The group of children who go quiet when the different one speaks, not out of cruelty, but out of incomprehension. None of these moments need to be traumatic in the clinical sense. They only require repetition. Because the child's mind is not designed to conclude these people don't understand me. It is designed to conclude something about me is wrong. That is the survival logic of a developing mind that depends entirely on its environment for safety and belonging. If the environment consistently signals that your natural way of being is too much, your mind will do everything in its power to change it. And so the wound forms, quietly, without ceremony. Not as a single devastating event, but as an accumulation of small moments where the message was the same. The real you is not safe here. Psychologists call this emotional misattunement, the chronic experience of not being truly seen by the people who were supposed to see you most clearly. Its effects do not stay in childhood. They travel. They embed themselves into the operating system of your adult identity as beliefs so deep you do not experience them as beliefs. You experience them as facts. I am too much for people. Fact. If they knew the real me, they would leave. Fact. Belonging is something other people have naturally. For me, it requires work. These are not truths. They are conclusions drawn by a child who did not have the context to draw any other conclusion. But they run your adult life with the authority of absolute truth, shaping who you let in, how much of yourself you reveal, how quickly you shrink when the room does not respond the way you hoped. And here is the most painful part. The very wound that makes you feel most different is also what makes you most perceptive, most compassionate, most attuned to the suffering of others, because you know what it feels like to not be seen. You know it in your body, and so you see others, really see them, in a way that most people never will. The wound and the gift are not separate. They never were. They are the same thing, experienced from different angles. But before you can access the gift, you have to do something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. You have to look directly at the self you built in response to that wound, the adapted self, the one that learned to be whoever it needed to be in order to stay safe, because that self is not you, and somewhere you have always known it. The mirror nobody showed you. At some point in your life, without realizing it, you stopped being yourself and started being your strategy. The strategy was brilliant. Sophisticated, adaptive, remarkably effective. It read rooms, adjusted tone, managed impressions, anticipated reactions. It kept you safe in environments that would have rejected the unfiltered version of you. You should not be ashamed of it. You built it under pressure, with the tools you had in conditions that left you no better option. But here is the problem with a strategy. At some point, it stops being something you use and starts being something you are. And when that happens, you lose access to the thing it was protecting. There is the authentic self, the one that existed before the world told you who to be, the one that had specific responses to beauty, specific things that made it come alive, specific ways of thinking that felt like home. And there is the conditioned self, the one that formed in response to feedback, rejection, approval, and survival. The one that learned to want what it was safe to want, and be whoever the room needed it to be. Most people never feel the fracture between the two. Their authentic and conditioned selves are close enough that the distance never registers as pain. But for you, for the person who has always felt different, that fracture is not subtle. It is the source of the ache. It is the reason you can be surrounded by people and feel alone, because the people are connecting with the conditioned version of you. And the authentic version is sitting just behind your eyes, invisible, waiting, slowly forgetting what it feels like to be seen. Here is the question no one ever asked you, and the one that matters most. Who were you before you decided who you needed to be? What did you love before you learned what was worth loving? What did you feel before you learned what was acceptable to feel? What did you think before you learned to preemptively censor the thoughts that made people uncomfortable? Most people cannot answer those questions immediately, Not because the answers do not exist, but because they have been buried under so many layers of adaptation that excavating them feels like archaeology. The answers survived. They always survive. The authentic self does not die under pressure. It goes quiet. It waits. And it communicates its continued existence through the very feeling you have been trying to resolve. The persistent, unshakable sense that the life you are living is not quite the one you were meant to be living. That feeling is not depression. It is not ingratitude. It is your authentic self knocking. And it has been knocking for a very long time. But answering that knock requires something most people are not prepared for. Because before you can meet your authentic self, you have to face what you did with the parts of it the world refused to accept. You have to go into the dark, into the place where you stored everything you were told was too much. That place has a name. The shadow you keep trying to outrun. Every part of you that you have ever been ashamed of did not disappear. It went underground. Carl Jung called it the shadow, not evil, not dangerous in itself, but the repository of everything the ego decided was unacceptable. The rage you were told was inappropriate, the ambition you learned to hide because it made others uncomfortable, the grief you were not given permission to fully feel, the wildness, the neediness, the depth, the strangeness. All of it went somewhere. And that somewhere is inside you right now, exerting more influence over your life than most of your conscious decisions ever will. Here is how the shadow works in practice. You meet someone who is effortlessly confident and feel an irrational surge of irritation. That irritation is not really about them. It is about the confidence you buried in yourself, because at some point you learned that taking up space was not safe. You watch someone express anger freely and feel simultaneously repelled and fascinated. That fascination is not about them. It is about the anger you have been swallowing for decades, because you learned that it cost you the love you needed. The shadow is not what you hate in others. It is what you recognize in others that you have forbidden in yourself. For people who are deeply sensitive, deeply perceptive, deeply intense, the shadow tends to be enormous. Not because they are more broken than others, but because they had more to suppress. They did not just learn to hide what they felt. They learned to be ashamed of how they felt. They internalized the world's discomfort with their depth and turned it into self-rejection. And self-rejection is the most exhausting project a human being can undertake. Because the self does not cooperate. It keeps returning. The shadow keeps surfacing, in dreams and overreactions, in the people you are inexplicably drawn to, in the patterns that repeat no matter how many times you swear they will not. The only way out is through. Not through suppression. You have already tried that. Not through self-improvement. That is often just a more sophisticated form of self-rejection. Through integration. Through the radical, terrifying, liberating act of turning toward the parts of yourself you have been running from and saying, I see you. You are not the enemy. You are me. Shadow work is not about becoming your worst impulses. It is about reclaiming the energy locked in them. Because every part of you that you have rejected is a part of you that is not available to your life. And you have been living on a fraction of yourself for so long that you have forgotten what full capacity feels like. But there is one shadow that sits above all others for people who feel chronically different. One pattern so deeply embedded it masquerades as a personality trait rather than a wound. And it is destroying your ability to connect. Not because it keeps people away, but because of what it does to you when it lets them in. Why belonging to everyone means belonging to no one. You are very good at becoming what people need. Almost too good. In certain environments with certain people, you can feel yourself shifting, adjusting your tone, your opinions, your energy, to match the room. It happens fast, almost before you are conscious of it. And in the moment, it feels like social skill, like empathy, like flexibility. And to some extent, it is all of those things. But underneath the skill, there is a fear. If I show up as fully myself, I will be rejected. And rejection, for someone who has spent their life feeling different, is not just uncomfortable. It is confirmation of the oldest wound. It is the universe agreeing with the verdict the child once reached. You are too much. You do not belong. So you adapt. You become whoever the room needs. You mirror the energy around you, soften your edges, amplify the parts of yourself that land well and quietly suppress the parts that do not. You become a master of belonging and a stranger to yourself. Here is the paradox no one warns you about. The more successfully you adapt, the more alone you feel. Because every connection built on an adapted version of yourself bypasses the real you. Every person who likes the performance does not know the performer. Every relationship built on strategic self-presentation cannot give you what you are actually looking for. The experience of being known, fully, without the translation. You can be loved by 100 people for who you pretend to be, and it will feel like nothing. Because the part of you that needs to be loved is not the part that is showing up. This is the loneliness that lives inside popularity, the isolation inside a full social calendar, the hunger that persists inside relationships that look, from the outside, like everything you said you wanted. The chameleon does not feel at home in any environment, not because no environment is good enough, but because it has forgotten what its own colors look like. You cannot find genuine belonging until you are willing to risk showing up as something specific, something that will inevitably not resonate with some people. Because the only love that will ever actually reach you is the love directed at the real you, not the curated one. That requires courage. But first, you need to understand that the thing you have been hiding, the difference, the depth, the intensity, the strangeness, was never the liability you were taught to believe it was. It never was. The gift hidden in the wound. Everything you were ashamed of is exactly what the world needs most. And almost no one has it. Not the wound itself. The wound is not romantic. And this is not an attempt to make suffering beautiful. The wound was real. The pain was real. The cost of carrying it has been real. Nothing that follows is meant to minimize any of that. But here is what is also real. The traits that made you feel most alien. Depth, sensitivity, perceptual acuity, emotional intensity, the capacity to hold complexity without collapsing it. These are not common. They are extraordinarily rare. And in a world that is increasingly shallow, increasingly reactive, increasingly allergic to nuance, they are not just rare. They are necessary. Think about the people who have moved you most deeply in your life, the ones who made you feel truly seen. What did they have in common? They were not performing. They were not editing themselves down to a digestible format. They were fully, uncomfortably, powerfully present, in their depth, their sensitivity, their willingness to engage with the real texture of human experience rather than the sanitized version. That is what you carry. That is what has been buried under the shame, the performance, the exhausting project of self-management. Not a problem. A capacity, not a disorder. A gift that has been living in a locked room because no one ever handed you the key. The sensitivity that made you feel too much is the same sensitivity that allows you to perceive what others miss. The intensity that made people uncomfortable is the same intensity that, when directed intentionally, produces extraordinary focus, creativity, and connection. The depth that made you feel alien in shallow conversations is the same depth that makes you capable of the kind of intimacy most people spend their entire lives searching for and never finding. You were not given too much. You were given more than the average environment knew how to receive, and that is a very different problem. Because environments can change, people can be chosen. Life can be built around a frequency rather than spent apologetically adjusting it. But here is what that actually requires. Not more self-improvement. Not more healing in the conventional sense. What it requires is a moment, a specific, internal moment, that looks less like a breakthrough and more like a quiet decision. The decision to stop translating yourself, and to find out, perhaps for the first time, what you actually sound like in your original language. The moment you stop translating yourself. It does not happen all at once. That is the first thing to understand. There is no single morning where you wake up and the performance is over and the authentic self has arrived, fully formed, ready to inhabit your life without fear. What actually happens is quieter, slower, and far more profound than any dramatic awakening. It starts with a moment of refusal. Small, almost imperceptible. A moment where someone expects you to shrink and you do not. A moment where the old script surfaces. Be less, be easier, be more like what they need. And instead of following it automatically, you pause. You feel the pull of it. And then you let it pass. The first time you do this, it feels wrong. Not wrong in the way that harmful things feel wrong, but wrong in the way that new things feel wrong, unfamiliar, exposed, uncertain. Because your nervous system has been calibrated to the performance for so long that authenticity registers as danger. Every alarm fires simultaneously. Pull back, adjust, you are too much. And yet, something else is also happening in that moment. Underneath the fear, a quality of presence you have not felt in a very long time. A sense of internal alignment, of the outside beginning, barely, to match the inside, of the translation gap beginning, just slightly, to close. What people who have moved through this describe first is not confidence. Confidence comes later. What they describe is a kind of clarity. The exhausting background noise of constant self-monitoring begins to quiet. The perpetual internal negotiation, is this too much, should I say this? How is this landing? Starts to lose its grip. Not because the world suddenly becomes safe, but because the internal relationship with yourself begins to shift from adversarial to something approaching honest. And in that shift, the energy consumed by the performance becomes available again. The bandwidth permanently allocated to self-management gets redirected toward actual presence, actual connection, actual creative and emotional output. You begin to show up in conversations not as a strategist, but as a participant. You begin to occupy your own life rather than observing it from behind the glass. This is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of a very different one. Because now the question is not how do I fit into the world as it is. The question becomes something most people never get to ask. What does a life built around my actual self actually look like? And that question, once it becomes real inside you, opens a door that cannot be closed again. The life that was waiting for you. On the other side of the performance, there is a life. It has been there the whole time. It is not a perfect life. It does not come without difficulty, without loss, without the ordinary suffering that is part of being human regardless of how integrated or authentic you become. The mind that has spent years in survival mode is desperately looking for a promised land, a final destination where the discomfort ends permanently. That place does not exist. What does exist is something more valuable than the absence of pain. On the other side of the performance is the presence of meaning, and the difference between a life that is merely survivable and one genuinely worth living often comes down to exactly that. Not the absence of hard things, but the presence of things that actually matter to the person living them. When you stop spending your energy translating yourself, something remarkable happens with that recovered energy. It moves. It seeks. It begins to orient toward what actually resonates rather than what is merely safe. The interests you suppressed because they seem too intense, they resurface. The creative impulses you managed down, they return with a force that surprises you. The kind of connection you always suspected was possible but never quite found, you begin to find it. Not because you have fixed yourself, but because you have stopped hiding the part of yourself that makes real connection possible. The relationships shift. Some, the ones built entirely on the adapted version of you, will struggle. Some will not survive the transition, and that will hurt. But the ones that remain, and the new ones that form around the real you, will have a quality the performance-based ones never had. They will feel like rest, like recognition, like the particular relief of being in a room where you do not have to work to exist. You will also find that the feeling of being different does not disappear, but its meaning changes entirely. It stops being a source of shame and starts being a form of orientation, a compass that tells you, with surprising accuracy, where you belong and where you do not, which environments expand you and which ones diminish you. The difference that once felt like a curse begins to function as a map. And perhaps most quietly, most profoundly, the internal noise begins to settle. The gap between the outside and the inside narrows. Not perfectly, not permanently, but enough. Enough to feel what it is like to be in your own life rather than just managing it. That life is not somewhere else. It is available from exactly where you are. But it requires one final truth, simple enough to say in a single sentence and deep enough to spend a lifetime understanding. You were never meant to fit in. You are not built for fitting in. And everything you have ever suffered in the attempt has been the pain of trying to be something you were never designed to be. This is not a consolation. It is a structural truth about who you are. And understanding it, really understanding it, not as an idea but as a lived reality inside your body, changes the entire orientation of your life. Fitting in requires sameness. It requires compressing yourself to a common denominator, making your edges soft enough that they do not catch on anything, moving at the pace of the average rather than at the pace of your own nature. Some people can do this with relatively little cost. Their authentic self and the social average are close enough that the distance between them is manageable. You are not one of those people. You have never been. Every strategy you have ever employed to become one has cost you something. Energy, authenticity, connection, creative vitality, the quiet joy of existing without the performance. You have paid an enormous price to chase something that was never available to you, not because you were not good enough to achieve it, but because you were too specifically yourself to dissolve into it. The goal was never to fit in. It was always to belong. And those two things are not the same. Fitting in is what happens when you change yourself to match the environment. Belonging is what happens when you find, or build, an environment that receives you as you already are. Fitting in is a performance. Belonging is a recognition. And no amount of masterful performance will ever produce the feeling of being genuinely recognized. The nervous system knows the difference. The part of you that has ached for so long knows the difference. That is why nothing has ever been enough. Not because you failed to find the right formula, but because you have been solving the wrong problem. The right problem, the real one, is not how do I become someone who belongs. It is how do I stop abandoning the person I already am. Because at the deepest level, the loneliness you carry is the loneliness of being estranged from yourself, of having spent so many years as the editor of your own experience that you have lost fluency in your own original language. The way back does not require a grand gesture or a radical life change. It requires the willingness to stop, in ordinary moments, and choose yourself. To let the thought be what it actually is. To let the feeling move through you rather than managing it for the comfort of others. To say the true thing instead of the safe thing. To take up the space that is actually yours. You are not too much. You were never too much. You were simply in the wrong rooms, speaking to people who had not yet developed the capacity to hear your frequency. And the answer has never been to turn the frequency down. The answer has always been to stop apologizing for it, to let it ring clearly, unapologetically, and trust that the people and places meant to resonate with it will find it. They will, because a signal that has stopped hiding itself is a signal that can finally be heard. You have been hiding for a very long time, and somewhere inside you, underneath all of that, the original is still there, untranslated, undiminished, waiting not for the world to finally be ready, but for you to finally decide that it does not need the world's permission to exist. That decision is available to you right now, not tomorrow, not after more healing, right now, with exactly the self you already are. You were never meant to fit in. You were meant to be found by the right people in the right places doing the right work. And none of that is possible until you stop hiding the thing that makes you findable. Stop translating. Start being. The world does not need another person who learned to fit in. It needs you, specifically fully, originally you, and it has been waiting far longer than you realize.